So this is the second lecture on Node.js with Express Web Framework. Let's get started. So today we will be looking at the idea of templating. That is to say, you create a layout that you can reuse to fill the data. For instance, if you're applying for something like a credit card, you have a form, a hard copy form, whereby you'll be typing in your name, your date of birth, your income, etc. So the data that is coming into this form is actually separate from the form itself. So the form can be thought of it as a template, and the data can percolate into it so that it becomes a full page of useful information, which you might think of as a web page. So that is the idea that we will start doing today. First, we will start with an HTML form with a get route. So far, in our previous week's examples, we had forms like checkbox form.html, a file in the public folder that was served to you that contained the form. Now, instead of having a file containing the form, you can actually have a server dynamically generate the form, which is very simple. Just copy and paste whatever the file contains in response to some route in the server, and that will just serve you the form. That is fairly simple. And then you can get this slightly fancier idea that if the form is submitted, then the same route behaves differently. So if you go to the route, let's say /checkbox form, it gives you the form the first time. But if you type in something and then submit it to the same route, /checkbox form, then it behaves differently because it knows that this data has come in. It doesn't have to show you the form anymore, and that makes the whole thing much more interesting in terms of dynamic behavior that your users will love. So that is the first part. That will use the notion of template literals. What are template literals? They are the strings that are created with backtick. We shall see that in a second. Then we will expand on that notion to get to something called a template engine. So there is a standard formal way of defining a template, not merely using backtick, which has its own problems, but using some other mechanism called a template engine. And that will make the whole thing much more robust, structured, encapsulated, and the concerns of different aspects of the program will be cleanly separated. All those things are very good things in software engineering. So that will be your exercise number 2. Lastly, we will actually look at data handling in a template. All those things I know at this point. I'm just giving you the topics. So these topics might sound quite scary at this point, but don't worry, you will get through all that in less than an hour. The first notion is a dynamic HTML form handling. The idea is that instead of getting the form from a file, an HTML file, a static file, you can actually dynamically generate it, which is not very complicated. It's just copy and paste the content of the HTML in response to one of the routes. Then you can assume in the beginning that you're getting the form from some route, and then you're submitting it to a different route. But since these are routes in a JavaScript program, you can actually combine them into just one route, and you can make the route behave differently because there's a function attached to the route, and that function can understand whether you're submitting the data or you're asking for the form the first time, and it can behave differently, and that makes it quite a bit nicer. In reality, later when we start doing databases, you will understand that the data is actually coming from a database, and there the behavior of the form, how the form is actually shown to you, will depend on the data, the status of the external world, as it were. Now let's look at this notion of template literals in JavaScript. Is a lot cleaner than using strings with concatenation. For instance, this string that you see in example 1 here is just a string. You could have used single quote here, or you could have used double quotes here. They will all work identical, but we choose to use backtick because once you have backtick, in addition to having just a literal string, you can also have a variable. In here, I could have a hello dollar with some variable there, and then the value of the variable will be pasted there, and that facility will work only in backtick. That is one thing. Second is that if you have line breaks, there's a line break here, there's another line break here, that will work only within backtick. So if this was a normal single quote or double quote, which are identical, there's no difference between those two, that just will not work. This will be a big error. In Visual Studio Code, you will see everything in red, so that will not work. Now the second part, as I mentioned, is the facility of being able to put variables in the string, and the variable values will be expanded. So you put Alice in name, and then you create a message string using backtick, and then the dollar brace name will be expanded to whatever that name contains. In this case, that is just Alice. That will work only with backtick. It's not merely variables, but it's actually any expression, any JavaScript expression, including function calls, that can actually be evaluated into a string. So in this case, I'm just saying A is 5, B is 10, so A plus B is actually 15, and 15 as a number in JavaScript can be cast into a string, and so in here that will just appear as 15 as part of the string. So if you were to do this example 3 in single quote, you would say hello there, and then a plus, and then name there, then another plus, another single quote for the next part. So that's quite ugly and a lot of work. So backtick is your friend. Now let's put all these things together in example 1, that is a text form. Here we will be trying to serve a form using a route rather than a static file. So we have week 5 examples, and example 1 in there I have server.js. So let's quickly look at this file before we launch the server. So it's an express server, as you can see here, requiring express. Express is a function that can be called to get a server object. Server has a method get, which will handle the route / text form here, and there's a request response there, and in the response all we are doing is sending this string with backtick. Backtick is needed because you see line breaks here, and that's all. Then what do you have in that string? It's a form with action pointing to process form with a method get. So there should be a server.get route there, server.get route with process form, as you can see here, and that takes the data, and there it is handling the data. It looks at the query, why query, because it's a form with get method, and full name there as a property of the query object within the request object. Why full name? Because that's the name of the text field there. So that becomes a property in this query object, and you can unpack that and use that as part of the string, again using backtick, so that you don't have to say plus here, plus there, string concatenation and all that kind of nonsense. So let's run this. As we know, we can just right click here, open a terminal right there. Then we can say npm install and node mon server.js. So what it is doing is running npm install. What will it install? That will depend on the package.json. If there is a dependency there, that will be installed. And after that, it is going to run server.js in node, but in the node mon fashion, so that if server.js changes for whatever reason, then the whole thing will just restart without you having to worry about it. So you can see that it actually installed something. Why did it install some stuff even though we didn't specifically say install anything? The reason is that package.json we had a dependency, and that dependency just got installed, which is very nice. Then it is actually looking at localhost 8000, and if I did this, that would be an error because the route / is not handled in my server, but what is handled is a text form that is handled, and that gives me that form that comes from here. Now I can submit something, Alex sent, then this Alex or this whole statement actually comes from this process form route, because that's where I'm sending the data, and I have the full name that is unpacked here, and that is what you're getting. Before we proceed, let's make one little change here. This is localhost. Localhost is fine for in-class exercises and examples, but for the lab test, because we are actually running it in a restricted environment, this may not work on Windows. So let's try 127.0.0.1. That is the default address of localhost, and let's save this. Now the server is actually running in 127.0.0.1 at the port 8000, so we can actually look for the text form in that address. So let me copy this, paste it in a new window with text form that gives you the same form. Now I can type in Alex, and that does the same thing. It's just that instead of localhost, I'm using the actual address of the localhost. A couple of more things I want to show you here. First of all, in the process form handler, we are unpacking the query full name property into full name. So let's actually look at it here by console logging it. Console log full name. So it restarts. That is good. Now send Alex. I see it here, but I also see Alex here, which is coming from that, which is as expected. Now suppose I go back and don't give anything there at all, just an empty string, what do you get? You get empty string. There's nothing coming through, which is the way you expect. And here also you see hello that. Now if you look at the address bar here, you can see that you're submitting it to process form as it should be with a query string full name equal to nothing. And if I take out the equal sign, that is identical to having equal to nothing, obviously, so that also is empty string. Now what I want to show you is, suppose I don't give anything at all, no query, just go into process form directly, what happens? What you're getting is undefined, which is what you get here. So at that point, if you unpack the query full name there from process form without having submitted anything, without having a query string attached to it, then you get undefined. That is something to keep in mind. I think I've told you everything I wanted to tell you about this one. So from now on, whenever I remember, I will replace localhost with this 127.0.0.1 so that you get used to seeing that for your lab test. So let's go through this once more in our slide. So what we did in server.js was to have a form which used a string literal, which is just this part, responding to this route text form, and that was just that string that was being sent back from the server to the client as part of the response. Now that string contained a form with action pointing to process form with method get. So in the same server, we also have process form as a different route where we actually unpacked full name from the query object with the property name full name, and we saw that in this string, which is again done using backtick, you get whatever you enter there. More than that, we also saw that if you don't enter anything at all, you of course get an empty string here. But on the other hand, if you go here directly, not by submitting from a form, but by just typing in process form, then full name actually comes with undefined value. That is important, and we will make use of that starting next example. So in this example, this is example 2, we have something that looks very similar to the previous one. But what we are actually doing is that the text form that responded to the initial request that you can see here, that is the one that gave you the form. And with that form, you submitted it, that is the full name equal to Alex that is over here. But you submitted to the same route. So that responded with that. So it's the same route that is handling the form delivery as well as processing of the form. That is what we want to see in example number 2. So we're done with example number 1. Let's go to example 2, and if that CD succeeds, let's actually install whatever we need to install coming from package.json, and then if that installation succeeds, let's launch our server using the node-mon command. So as you can see, I made a tiny error here, and because of that, the first command did not succeed, so the second one was not run, which is nice. So this and thingy is a nice facility. I can just go back and fix it by giving the right name, then it does something. Now I don't need this. I will go to example 2, and package.json had the dependency, so all those things got installed, all good. We will keep this here, and here again we are starting with Express being required, and then Express is run to get a server, and a get route is created, and the route is pointing to text form /text form, and there first thing I'm doing is unpacking full name coming from query full name. Remember, if nothing is submitted, when we went to process form with nothing submitted, full name turned out to be undefined. So if it is undefined, that means the guy is coming here, your user is coming here without having submitted anything. So full name is undefined, means he hasn't submitted anything. That means he needs to get the form, send the form. Otherwise, if full name is not undefined, if it is something, that means the guy has submitted something. That means he doesn't need to see the form anymore. So this part is not done, but the else clause is run, and there he just handles. So that makes it a bit nicer and more powerful, as you will understand later on. Good. So let's see if that works. One thing I want to do again here is, instead of localhost, I'm going to make it 127.0.0.1. That is just an alias for localhost, or rather localhost is an alias for this one. It's just that localhost may not work in Windows when you're running it in lab test. So let me save it. Now the server is running there, which is well and good. And here I'm going to say text form. I get the form as per before, then Alex, I get that. Now you might think that nothing has changed. How do you know that this new server is being used? If you don't trust me, let me show this to you. So we're going to say enter your name. I'm going to say example 2, and hi, full name, welcome to IS-113, again exam 2, just show that it is actually that. Go back here, reload this, exam 2, Alex, send it from exam 2. So it is really that single route that is actually run for both these things. And again, you can see it from here. First time we did this without the query string, so you get the form. Second time we did this with the query string, which means something was submitted, this, and that just went to the same route. Get the same route here. That is example 2. So explaining this once more using the slide. This is our server.js. Full name is unpacked from the request object in the query property under full name, because full name is the name of the text box. And if the user is coming there for the first time, then this will be undefined. In that case, just send him the form using the backtick literal. Otherwise, if there is a full name, then respond to that by saying hi. So that's what we did. Now I have an exercise for you. This exercise is quite similar to what we did, but you really have to do this. I'm not going to go through the exercise because you have to practice. So please go through this one and make sure that you understand every last bit of it, all the nitty-gritty of this exercise and all other exercises in this slide deck, as well as your extra exercise. Quite a bit of work for you. Now we move on to this concept of template engine. So template engine is basically a module, a library that can take something that looks like an HTML file, but with JavaScript variables in it that can be expanded. So the template engine that we will be using is called EJS, embedded JavaScript. There are other engines called Pug and Handlebars and all that, but we'll be using EJS, which is one of the more popular ones, I believe, and also it is fairly simple to learn. So embedded JavaScript basically means you're embedding JavaScript code inside some HTML, and then you're running that, you're taking that file as the input into JavaScript server.js, and then sprinkling it with some data, and all the right data variable names will end up in the right places through some tricks such as you have to set it up. We will see that it's not as complicated as it sounds. It's fairly simple. Let's go back to our example for a second. If you have this inside JavaScript, this is fine. We know that this works, but this is actually HTML code, which means you are putting this HTML code as a string. That means Visual Studio Code will not see this as HTML. It'll just take this as string, and it wouldn't try to help you with any kind of formatting or indentation or anything. You have to worry about all those things yourself. Similarly, this also is actually an HTML code. It could be something much more complicated as an HTML string, but Visual Studio Code is not going to help you with it. And if you want that help from Visual Studio Code, obviously you have to put that as an HTML file, in which case you cannot get the data. This is a JavaScript variable. So you want the best of both worlds. You want the facility of using HTML formatting and separation of the file, so that the concerns of the software packages that you're creating are cleanly separated into the logic in one place and the view or rendering in a different place. So the best of both worlds is given to you by EJS, or a template engine. So it's got tags that look like HTML tags because it's actually like an HTML file. It's just that in some places you're going to actually put some JavaScript in there. So angle bracket %sign is an indication that it is actually embedded JavaScript. And the first thing that you will use most commonly is this % with an equal sign. This means whatever variable that you see here, just expand it and paste it right there as plain text, and expand it with escaping. You will see what that means in a second. But in a simple case, suppose I write hello in an EJS file, a template file, and there I have this. That means expand it and paste it there, and that is the end of that EJS tag. So whatever name is will be pasted there. Suppose the name variable had a value Manoj, then it will be hello Manoj. So that is how you would actually display different messages using both strings as well as variables together. Then the same kind of idea here, but with a minus. That means it's the same thing, but it is unescaped. Unescaped means it doesn't make the HTML tags or any kind of script tags safe. It will basically just render it as you specify it here. For that reason, this is a bit dangerous. So most of the time we'll be using this unless you really need to use this, which we will see an example of. Then there's comment. Then if you really want to put percentage in instead of actually running it, so that is that. And the most important thing again So this is one most important thing. This is probably even more important than the most important thing. This is the one that will actually let you run JavaScript. So there's no output there. It's just JavaScript. So for instance, if you have this guy, so there is a user variable. If that is defined, if it is not empty, and if it is not null or whatever, if it is defined, then just say welcome. And what is this? That is to actually put the name of the user right there. So user presumably is an object which has a property name, and if user is not empty, if it is not null, that means that property is probably there. So user.name will be pasted there inside a paragraph. So this is just string, this is just string, but this part is a JavaScript thing, and this is an EJS tag saying that print it. And again, this is a JavaScript part that is to close this open statement that has to be closed somewhere, and that is here. Similarly, you can actually have loops. So there is a string here, and here JavaScript starts. Items is actually an array of array of items, and for each of them, take it as item and run this function starting here, and that function's got a string first, and then just printing out the item, then another string that is to close the line item, and then this is to close that brace there, and this one, this parenthesis, is to close that guy there, and then you have closed the UL. So as you can see, this is going to be a bit tedious, especially to keep track of all these opening and closing of different angle brackets, braces, parentheses, etc. But this I would think that Visual Studio Code will probably help you with matching all these things. Now, this kind of rendering is done using this engine called EJS, and so you have to actually install it. So that's very easy. npm I EJS will install that, and then what it means is that then your server.js or JavaScript Express can understand what .ejs files are, and then you can use those files to render it. So the first thing to do in your server is to say that the rendering engine that you're using is actually EJS. That is called View Engine. Set that to EJS. And then you have to say where you will keep all these EJS files, and that by default those files are going to be in .views, so we're not going to change that. So this statement is optional. If you're keeping everything in .views, then you don't have to say it, but if you are silly enough to actually put it somewhere else, then you will have to set that location using this statement. So after that, all you have to do is to say response.render. The first argument there is just the name of the view file without the EJS, and then the second argument there are the variables that you're trying to pass into that view. So that will become clearer once you actually see an example. So here is the first example. So you have age as a local variable, and then you're saying response render greeting, that is a string. So that means there is a greeting.ejs file inside your views folder. So that is the file that you see here. This is almost like an HTML file, except that you have some EJS tags here and there. In the EJS tag, you're going to say hi name, I am age years old. So name and age are variables. And how does the EJS file greeting.ejs know what the values are? That's because you're actually saying render greeting with this object starting here to here that has a property name and a property age which has a value 25. Remember the way of dynamically creating an object. Just start with brace, end with brace. In there you have the property name and its value, but if the property name happens to be a local variable, you don't have to specify the value. You can just use the name, the property name. It'll take the value from the local context, local scope. So once that is there inside EJS, because you're calling it using render, it knows that name is actually Alice, age is actually age, which is 25. So hi Alice, I'm 25 years old. Now you can have any kind of data inside the object that you're passing to the render method. Response object has a render method, and that's the one you're using. So any kind of object, so the true false kind of variable, that is boolean, so you can just use that directly in a JavaScript block inside the EJS file. So in this case you're rendering dashboard, so that means in views there will be a dashboard.ejs, and in that dashboard.ejs you're actually using a variable called is logged in, and that is being passed using this object here. So that's that. It can of course take arrays. So here I have a users view, that is users.ejs in my views folder. In that, in response to some route, I'm actually rendering that with the data. That is an object containing one property, which is an array of users. Then inside users.ejs, the view file, I'm looping over users, and for each user, users.forEach is walking through the array users, and each element then becomes whatever dummy variable you have here. And for each user, I am running this function, and the function is a mixture of a string plus a EJS tag saying just print out the username, and then string again, and then the function is closed here inside the embedded JavaScript. So what's happening? I come here, I start UL, so I have an unordered list there, and for each user I create a line item here, so I can see Alice, Bob and Charlie. All those guys are actually coming from my array. Then array can be an array of objects. This is probably the way you will end up using it when you have a real application, maybe like in your project. You will probably have a render statements with a view students, for instance. That means students.ejs will be there in my views folder, and that is getting an object which has property students, which is an array, and that is an array of objects. This is an object for student, there's a second student. Then again, I'm trying to create a table, so table as a literal, and the students an array for each one of the elements in the students as an array. That is this. Now it becomes the first object first, the first student Jane, and then it's the second student, but object, not just the student name. But the object has a name, property, and a grade properties, object student name, and then student grade. So it just prints out the table Jane A, John B, because table is printed first, and the loop, one row for each student, and each row has two cells. Each cell has the name first and then the grade cell, which is what you see. One more example. So if you have a nested object, we have an object there with user as a property, but the property value itself is another object which has properties name and email. So then you can actually unpack. All these things are just playing around with the objects, but you know these things. This is not very complicated, but get used to it. If you find these things a bit mysterious, then play with it, copy and paste this code somewhere, and try to understand completely how this is actually working. One thing you have to worry about is the fact that when you're using unescaped code in EJS, unescaped echo in EJS, there is a potential for some security holes. So you have to be aware of this, and then you have to worry about those things, especially if it is in response to a form that is exposed to the word. Suppose it's a text field like a username, and then you're trying to say hi username. And if you do that echo using the minus here rather than equal sign, which means it's unescaped, then some hacker somewhere is going to type in some piece of code in your text box user and hoping that that can take some action, and that is a cross-site scripting kind of attempts, and that you have to be worried about. So there is one example here that might illustrate the point. So here I'm echoing using equal sign. So I have an object that is created out of a name and content. Let's say the name and the content came from some form, and instead of typing in a name, the hacker actually typed in a script saying alert, which is a message box, and he's just going to say hack, and that is a script. And if you render it using equal sign, this is harmless. This is rendered harmlessly because all these things, all these greater than and less than signs, which indicate the beginning and ending of different tags, will be translated to ampersand LT semicolon ampersand GT semicolon etc. Those things will be rendered like this by Chrome. They will not be executed, they will not be run, they will be just echoed with escaping. This is the way it should be. So the hacker will just see that in response to whatever he tried to do. On the other hand, if you had minus there, then this will become part of your HTML code without any kind of escaping, and this basically says show a message box saying hack, and that's the message box that you will see. Once the hacker sees this, then he will actually do something much more malicious than this, trying to get into your system. So minus as part of this EJS tag when you're trying to echo something, especially something that is coming from a form where you don't have a control over the string, is very, very dangerous. If it is from within your code, it can be tolerated, but even then the best bet is to always use this tag with equal sign. That means escaped whenever possible. So here is a list of all those properties. Escaped output, that means it is you cannot perform any kind of XSS attack, cross-site scripting attack, but at the same time you cannot display any HTML code. Well, you cannot display any HTML code as you intended it to be. If you say H1 Manoj H1, you will actually see H1 Manoj H1 rather than Manoj in H1. Basically, it converts all these guys into HTML entities, meaning they will be escaped. So HTML tags will not be actually rendered as intended. On the other hand, those things will be rendered, but then this is a security hole. Now let's actually play with EJS a little bit. So this is going to be in example 3. The package.json file now has the dependency on EJS. So when I say npm I, EJS also will start, which is 9. After that, we will be using text form EJS to render something rather than a route text form directly. So let's take a look at that one. This is example 3. So example 2 is done. So we kill this. This server is no longer needed. Then we go to example 3. This is the one that we will run. So before that, we have to go to example 3 and install and run it. So everything seems to have worked perfectly fine. Down here, we're going to modify this to 127.0.0.1. Save it. Now let's look at the code. As usual, Express is loaded by requiring it, then server, then Express server. Then we set the view engine to EJS. We're not actually explicitly setting the views folder to views because we're going to use views, so we don't have to set it. Then we're going to get text form, meaning we're going to need to set up a route for text form where it is a request response, and we unpack directly what the query contains as full name, and then we render. So response render instead of response send. What are we rendering? Text form. Where is it going to be? It's going to be in the views folder in text form. So let's get that one. So this is what it is. And here, starting from the top, it is an HTML file. It's got a body. And this, as you know by now, this is a JavaScript code. It says if the full name is not defined, do this, serve the form. Now, how does it know what full name is? For that, you have to come back here and see what we are doing there. We are rendering this with this data, that is the second argument to the render method, and that contains full name. So that is a full name that is available here. If it is undefined, then serve the data. Otherwise, use the same full name to say that hi full name. Now notice that this is not just percent, it's actually percent equal to. We are escaping it because full name is actually going to come from this text box. Just in case a hacker sees this text box and types in something naughty there, we want to be able to escape that out. So that's that. So let's see this in action. So now it's again text form coming from localhost. So it's that again to convince you that this is actually this that is running. Let me give a EJS tag there, reload. So it's actually the EJS thing, the one that I just modified. Where did I modify? I modified it in the EJS file, the view file. So Alex again sent, and then comes from the EJS file again. From this part, it comes back with that message again, delegated to the view file from this server.get method, which is responding to this route, and it's just delegating the handling of the view to the view file. So this is what happened. We went to text form in the localhost, and that gave us a form where we typed in Alex, and then we saw the response there. The first thing that we did was to set the view engine to EJS. This is important. And then we rendered an EJS file, a view, which is text form, which will be inside the views folder, and we passed the data full name. So what happens is that if the full name, which is available to the EJS file at that point when it is being rendered, if it is undefined, then it serves the form. Otherwise, it just responds to the data that came through. So let's use a little bit of animation to explain this once more. First, we need the form. So when we go to text form for the first time, what's happening is that there is a request coming to the server, to our server.js. At that point, we don't have the first name defined. So it comes to the route that you're looking for, because that's what you're looking for. You're looking for text form, and it looks for text form, and this is a get method. So that's where it's going to end up. There it unpacks full name, which will turn out to be undefined because there is nothing here. There's nothing under full name there as a query string. Then at that point, we are saying render of a view. So it'll go and look at the view, and there it's getting full name because that is the data that is being passed to the view. And at this point, it's actually undefined. So that is the part that will be run. So the if clause will be executed, which is just a form that will come back to the server, and server will just relay it back to you, and Chrome will render that, and that's what you will see here. Then you type in Alex, and then hit send. At that point, it comes back here. At this point, you have full name, and full name is Alex. So request query full name is actually Alex. So this local constant becomes Alex, and then again you are rendering using text form view. So it will load text form view, but this time with this value Alex there. So it comes here, then full name is not undefined, it's Alex. So it will go and hit the else clause where this is Alex, and that will come back to the server, which will relay it back to Chrome, which will render it for you. Now let's do a slightly more complicated example, this time with a little bit of data validation on the server side. So this is example number 4. What we want to do is to have a form that is similar to what we have been looking at, except that there is an extra checkbox here. Now the thing is, if the user has entered something meaningful in the text box as a name rather than just white spaces, and also he has checked this agreed to TNC checkbox, and then he sends the form, submits the form, then everything is fine. Then we want to show that message. On the other hand, if he hasn't entered anything, or if he has entered only white spaces, and if he hasn't checked this guy, then we want to have 2 error messages displayed there. Not only that, if he has entered a name but hasn't agreed to the TNC, then the corresponding error message will be displayed, one of the 2 error messages that is. And if he hasn't entered a name, or he has entered white spaces there but he has agreed to the TNC, then that error message will be shown. So this is what we want to do, and let's see how that is done. So this is in example 4. So let's kill this guy here, go to example 4. This is what we want, this. So example 4, server.js. As usual, I'm going to change this to 127.0.0.1 just so that you get used to it. Then let's look at the server right from the top. Again, Express is loaded and the server is an Express server. Then the view engine is set. View engine, this is important because we are using EJS, embedded JavaScript. And then the form that we want to load now is called consent form, and that is what we're going to set the name of the route to be. So get request to consent form that unpacks something called the raw full name from the query full name. The reason is that we unpack whatever the user has provided to you, and if he has provided only white spaces, we want to trim out the white space. Then consent is a request query consent, which is actually the name of the consent box. Then before looking at the processing from here to here, that is the error handling, let's look at the form for a second. And the form is obtained by just saying consent form being rendered as part of the response. And how does that work? Where does server.js get consent form from? It's a view, because it's rendering something, it's rendering a view, and that has to be inside the view consent form. So let's look at that one. Ignoring all the EJS tags, we can locate the form right here. It says form action is consent form. So when the form is submitted, it's going to go back to the same route, and the method is get. There it is a full name as a text box, and it's got something extra here which we will understand in a second. And checkbox, the name is consent, and that is what I wanted to show you. And then there's a submit button. So let's go back to the top of the route here. So the raw full name is what the user will be typing in. I'll come back to you. Consent is, as you saw, is a checkbox, and that also comes back to you. The first thing maybe we want to do at this point is to just see what those things are. So let's actually do the console.log request query, and that's it. So let's print out the request query at this point if there is anything coming to you. So that will appear here in my Visual Studio Code terminal, so we can see the restarter. We're going to load it. It's called consent form now. So it loaded that. At the same time, the server printed out something. It says the object is null, meaning there is no query object inside request. Request doesn't have a property called query, or if it does, it's a null object. So let's actually type in something, David, and agree to TNC. Send it. Now it's an object that contains full name David, consent is on. So there is something in consent, something in the full name as David. So this is what we're looking for. Now instead of David, suppose I go back here, reload it, and suppose there I type in some spaces and agree, then it says enter your name, even though I typed in spaces there, that did not take. So let's look at that. So it actually got the full name as spaces and consent, but this was ignored. And why is that ignored? Because it was unpacked as raw full name and consent was just on. Whenever it's checked, it's on. Let's also check what it is when it's not. Suppose it's not checked and name is David and agree to TNC, but we can see that the consent property is not there. So that is going to be undefined. Consent is going to be undefined. To show that to you once more, console.log.consent. Let's print that and send it again. Actually undefined. So that is important to keep in mind. Now after having done those things, I probably don't need this. Comment that out. Okay, so we're looking at raw full name. That was a couple of submissions ago. That was actually some spaces. So that is raw full name. And now I'm creating a new variable called full name, initializing it to an empty string, and also initializing a variable called errors as an array. Now I say if raw full name is not undefined, meaning there was something that the user typed in, but it could be spaces. The full name name is actually raw full name trim. Trim is a method that will just remove beginning and ending white spaces. So if it is all spaces, then this will turn out to be just empty string. Now the next one is if full name is empty string, which means raw full name was either empty or it was just white spaces, not meaningful, then I put in my errors array an error called please enter your name. The second one is I look at consent. If it is undefined as it was in this submission, I push an error message called please agree to TNC. That becomes the second element in this error. So I got two errors if full name is blank and consent was not given to the TNC. If full name is not blank, then this error will not be there. There's only one error. And if the full name was empty but the consent was not given, only this error will be there. So everything is perfect, this error hand part. Now I'm looking at the length of the errors array. If it is more than 0, that means there was at least one error, then I'm loading this consent form but with full name, which is the trimmed version of the raw full name, and consent, which is whatever that user has consented to. It could be on or undefined. Then an error string, which is my errors array. This time I'm joining the errors array using BR, using HTML line break. Notice that this is actually HTML line break, so this is HTML code. That's what I have as error string. On the other hand, if the error length was actually 0, then I'm rendering the same form with full name, consent, and the error string being an empty string. We will verify in a second whether this part is actually necessary, but that's the way it is done for now. Now let's go back to the view file again. So it knows the full name, it knows the consent, and it also knows the error string. These three variables containing data have actually come to the view file. Now if full name and consent, that means full name is not empty, consent is not undefined, is actually on. In that case, I just say hi full name that. Otherwise, some problem has occurred. Then I'm saying give the form and give the checkbox and then the button. So I'm sending a string containing all those things in a form, and at the same time, whatever the value is of the full name is at that point, I am actually setting that as a default value of the text field. And if the consent is on, consent is not empty, then I'm saying check. So let's take a look at this part and this part a bit carefully. So what does this do? So this is a EJS echo of the full name, and when I came in here, I had a problem. Either the full name was empty or the consent was empty. Suppose the consent was empty but full name had some value, then this has some value, David for instance. So I want to set the default value to David, whatever that full name is. So that's what this part does. On the other hand, if consent was given but the full name wasn't there, then full name wouldn't be there, so that is empty. So it's okay, value is just an empty string, that is fine. Why is it an empty string and not undefined? Because we initialize that way. We initialize full name to an empty string and then we set trim the raw full name. So it is either going to be an empty string or going to be a trimmed version of whatever the user typed in. So whatever the user typed in with the trimming will appear there, and it could be an empty string, but it's never going to be undefined at this point. On the other hand, consent can be undefined because we didn't mess with it. So remember, this is the ternary operator. It is basically saying look at the first variable as a boolean. If it is true, then put that there. That is what this percent equal to means. Whatever the value of this thing will be just pasted there. So what's the value? If consent is true, then it says check. Consent is true means that the user has checked before, so the check status will be persistent. If the consent is not defined, then the user hasn't agreed, in which case nothing is printed. So the value of the whole thing from here to here is either check or is it just an empty string. So that's what will be printed there. So the checkbox will be pre-checked if the user has previously agreed to the TNC. Otherwise, it will be left unchecked. So that's what that's. So that is the form part. And then if there is an error string, just echo the error string. But now we have to be a bit careful. We have to use this, not an equal sign, because equal sign will mean the BRs that we entered earlier will appear as BR in the Chrome window rather than a line break. So that we will see in a second by replacing this with equal sign. But before that, let's save this. Okay, then let's go here and try different set. First of all, we'll go to consent form to begin with, loading it for the first time. Nothing there. So loading for the first time. There are no error messages because the user hasn't entered anything. Now let's try David and agree to TNC. So that works that way. This was the first requirement. I'm actually responding to the requirements specified in our slides. So this was the first requirement. If David and checked, then this should be printed. We managed to do that. Then the next requirement is nothing is entered and the TNC is not agreed to, in which case I should get two error messages. So go back here, consent form, just reload the form. Nothing is entered, no TNC, send two error messages. So we managed to do that. Then the third one, this will happen the same way, even if I have spaces here, and then I'll get 2 error messages because spaces are just trimmed out, as you saw. The next requirement is either the name or the TNC, one at a time. So let's say name is David, but TNC is not agreed to, then I get 1 error message, as we saw here. Now I don't have a name, but I agree to the TNC, then I get the other error. So I don't have a name and I agree to the TNC, I have another error message. But what's interesting to note is that the status of the checkbox there persisted. That's the way we expect. Now just to see that once more, let's say David, I did not agree to the TNC. Actually, let's start from a consent form. Suppose I type in David, I don't agree to the TNC, I come here, the error message is there. At the same time, I have the name that I typed in persisting, which is important. This kind of a little usability tweak will make your website a lot more popular, because if the user has to come back here and then type in everything before agree to TNC just because he forgot something, that is clearly not the right thing to do. Now the next thing I wanted to check, I promised that I would check. I said that maybe this part is not necessary, else clause is not necessary. Actually the whole if thing is not necessary. So this part, let's try it. Now I don't have a name. Okay, I reload the form, I don't have a name, I don't have this. Send, obviously I get 2 error messages. Then I say David, send, I get 1 error message and I say David, but I agree to it. I get the other error message, everything is persisting as per normal. Try David once more, send, that's working fine. And if I have both, and welcome to IS-113. So the whole thing is working without having this if statement, because arrays.join will join the array arrays using BR, and if the array is empty, that is fine, it will just return an empty string. So that was fine with or without that statement. We didn't need to do a check on the length of the array, so that was superfluous. I just want to check that. Good. Now let's go back to the slides and see how this actually works. So the first thing that we had was to create error messages. So error was initialized if the full name is empty, full name being the trimmed version of the thing that the user typed in. Then I push that error message into the array. If consent is not defined, that means the guy hasn't checked the TNC box, then I put that error message there. So potentially 2 error messages, 0, 1 or 2 error messages really. And then if the length is greater than 0, I did this. Otherwise I put an empty string there. But as we saw, this statement would have sufficed. We didn't really need to have this if statement, because when the errors array is actually empty, joining it using whatever it is that you're joining with doesn't matter, that will still stay an empty. So that if statement was a bit of an overkill. Then in the view file, the EJS file, I looked at the value of a full name, which could be an empty string or a trimmed version of whatever the user has typed in, and the consent, which could be undefined or on. And if there is anything that the user has typed in, I'm persisting it by setting it as the default value of the text box. And if the user has actually checked the TNC box, then consent will be not undefined, in which case consent will evaluate to true. So I'm going to say checked. That means I'm going to check the checkbox by default. And if there is error message, then I'm actually echoing it, but I am echoing it with that minus sign rather than equal sign. And the reason is that error message contains BR, which is HTML code. Error message contains BR. So let's actually make this in the view engine. Let's make this equal. Notice that my server did not reload. It doesn't have to. The EJS view file is not like a JavaScript. It's actually something that is read every single time there is a request. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to restart the server. So I'm actually sending the error message, printing the error message, this time escaping it. Let's go back to my browser window and reload this, and I'm not typing in anything and sending it. Now you can see that BR appeared as BR because it was escaped. So if this was script or something naughty, it will not be run, it will not be executed, it will just be echoed, which is the way it should be in most cases. Right, so now you have an exercise basically putting together these ideas, and EJS, please do this on your own, practice a lot. Not merely this, maybe do the extra exercise too. So what we were doing so far was to just take the data from the user and then do some manipulation of the data and then send it back to the user. But in a real web application such as your eLearn, for instance, when you log in, it will actually show you the modules that you are registered to. So that is actually talking to a database somewhere, getting the information. Or if you go and look at your grades, you'll actually pick up your grades from some database and show it to you. So there's a lot of work that is going on in the backend. We haven't reached that level of sophistication yet in terms of databases, etc. But we do know how to mock it up, meaning instead of having a database, maybe we can have some data in our server.js and then see how we can use that data. So data is not coming from the database, but it's there in our server.js. So that's a little bit of practice of that. So that's our example 5. So let's take a look at how that is done. Basically, we have three items here: apple, banana, and cherry. And we don't want to hard code these things in your EJS. You probably want to have apple, banana, and cherry as a data structure, maybe as an array. So we will see that in example 5. So we're done with example 4. Kill the sucker. Go to exam 5. Install everything that is needed, and then start service with that exam 5 and have server. And again, just for the heck of it, today I'm going to consistently make this localhost that so that you get used to seeing it. Now again, let's take a look at this. The code. Express is loaded. Server is an Express server, and we have this. This statement is actually required if you're submitting anything using post. So far in today's video, we submitted everything using get, so this one is not needed. But the moment you start using post, as you can see here, the data will be in body, and that data will be filled only if you have this. So that is very important. Then of course you have to set EJS engine as your view engine. Then here, this is what we are hard coding as fruits. But you can imagine if you have like hundreds of fruits, maybe they can come from a database as a table of fruits and their properties or values or prices or whatever. But in this case, we're just hard coding to show you as an example. Now we want to show you a fruit form, and that is to render fruit form, which is an EJS file that's in views fruit form right there. So it's an action fruit form, method is post, and what we're doing is fruits for each. So we are walking through the array of fruits. Each element is being called fruit, and then we are just echoing the value here and the display here as a checkbox. Right. So that's all there is to it in rendering the form and getting the data from the form in post. When the data is posted, then the post server.post route will be used. Data is gotten, meaning the first time the user tries to load it, that will be a get request. So this will be used, and the data is posted. This will be name of the route can be the same, which is nice. Okay, now last week, if you remember, I gave you an example of checkboxes which can result in undefined or a string or an array of string. Let's take a look at that one just to understand that once more. That was our last example, example 10 last week. You don't have to go there. I'm just telling you this once more. So there were 3 topics with checkboxes. What they were like art, science, and something else. And if the topics variable that came back to you using post in body topics, if that was undefined, then you had to handle it saying you did not select any topics. Otherwise, if it was an array, then you joined the array using comma and space and then rendered that. And if there was only one, then in that case that would be just a string, so I rendered that. So this is what we did last week. That is fine. And this week we have a similar situation. We have 3 fruits, apple, banana, and cherry, and the user might select 0, 1, 2, or 3 fruits. So we have to deal with all the different cases, and let's see how that is done here. So when you are posting, after selecting 0, 1, 2, or 3 fruits, you come here, and then I'm saying selected fruits is request body products. Why products? Because if you look at the fruit form checkbox, the name is product. Name is not fruits, but products. So selected products would be request body. Why body? Because it's post and products. This is a tricky expression. What this is saying, you have to read it this way. Constant selected products is whatever is coming from request body products or empty. If nothing is coming from there, if this is undefined, then it's an empty. So that's the way to read. Okay, then I create a constant selector. If the selected products is an array, which means either it was empty, in which case it's an empty array, or multiple things were selected, in which case it would really be an array with values in it, then I just keep it as selected products. If it is an array, just keep it that way. And if it is not, then it will be a single element and put it in an array of single elements. So I make it in array. So I force the selected products to be an array. So this guy is guaranteed to be an array. So this is what I was saying. I said in the last video that I'm going to stretch your imagination and I'll invite you to solve that problem differently. And this is exactly that kind of solution. So you make the variable kind of cajole it into an array, either by saying an empty array or an array with single element, or if multiple things are selected, sure, that is already an array. So then what you're saying in the statement is you selected either nothing if nothing was selected, otherwise just join the selected array, selected is an array, with a comma. If selected length is more than 0, then something was selected, and in which case it's just this is a ternary operator, otherwise just nothing. So in order to get the form, we are actually using EJS. In order to actually show the selection, we're not using EJS, we're not using a template, we're just doing it right here using this backtick. So let's save this and see this in action. So that, suppose I start with nothing selected, select nothing, I select 1, selected apple, select 2, I select apple and banana, and this is happening because of that join statement here, select join, and I go back and select 3, then all 3 are selected. That is just to show you one way of handling multiple selections, which can be empty or undefined or a string or an array of string. Okay, let's understand this a bit more using our slides here. So I'm using hard-coded fruits as my data source. Then I'm sending fruits to my fruits form, which is an EJS file in my views folder. There I'll render those things using a loop. Then that is if the guy is getting the form, so get request for fruit form, that is providing the form. And if the guy is posting something to the form, I use the same route and I look at the thing that is submitted, which will be in body because it is get, and products because that's the name of the checkboxes. And if it is undefined, then I set it to an empty array. Otherwise, I define a new variable called selected. If the selected products is an array, which it will be if nothing was selected or multiple things are selected, not if one single fruit is selected. If it is multiple things that are selected or nothing is selected, in which case we explicitly set it to an array, an empty array. So if it is an array, then don't do anything, just keep it as a select products. Otherwise, it's a single element which will be a string, put it in an array here. So that's the idea. So now I know for sure that selected is an array. It could be an empty array, an array with one element, or an array with multiple. And after that, I'm planning to join them if the array length is more than 0. That means at least one fruit is selected. That's the ternary operator here. And if nothing is selected, then the array length will be 0. In that case, I'll say nothing. So that's what happened. So looking at our view file, EJS, I have the fruits that came from my JS file because I rendered this using fruits as an object. So fruits will be an array here, and for each one of the fruits as fruit, remember this is a dummy variable. You could call this just f or x or whatever you want. And this is inside the JavaScript part. Then I'm putting it in a div and I'm calling it a checkbox. I'm putting it inside a checkbox, input of type checkbox, calling it, the name is of products, and the value is fruit. It could be apple, banana, or cherry, and the label that you will see next to it also is fruit, apple, banana, cherry. That's what we saw, and then created a submit. So there's one more example, the last example of today. We will be getting data from an object in our view file. So the EJS file will get data from an object. Let's see how that works. So this is in example number 6. So let's go there and launch the server first. We don't need this. Example 6. This is the one we will look at. But before looking at it, first thing to do, as usual, we're going to make this 127.0.0.1. Save it. Then we will say go to example 6. If that succeeds, install whatever needs to be installed, and then launch the server. Now we can look at the code. Express is loaded, and server is an Express server. Then we say URL encoded so that post request can be handled. Earlier we saw a slightly more complicated statement. Now this is the one that is given, and that apparently is enough. Then we set the view engine. All these things are fairly standard in most projects that you will do. So these things will appear in the near the top. Engine is going to be EJS, nothing else. Then we have phone book, which is an object. Object, as you know, plays the role of a dictionary in Python, except that the first element there is a property. In the key value pair, the key is not a string, but it's a property because it's an object. So there are no quotation marks around it. And also when you want to access Bob, it will be phonebook.bob, but we have seen that it can also be accessed using phone book with square bracket syntax. There's a search form that will be served when somebody tries to access the search form using get. And the same search form route, if somebody is posting to it, then we will actually look at the body of the request that is coming in, and body because it's post, and we will look for person as a property, and then we will have a message that is empty to begin with, so that's the initialization. And then we say if phone book square bracket person, so this is the same as saying phone book dot bob or dot whatever whatever. It's just that if dot whatever, that whatever part is a variable, you cannot use a dot format, you have to use a square format. So square is the thing to do here. So if person that you type in is a Bob or Andy, then you will get a phone book Bob or Andy, and then you will say Bob's or Andy's phone number is a phone book Bob or Andy. So that will work fine. If that property is not there, it's not there means it's empty, undefined, then we will say message person is not in the phone book. So it's all very clear. So what we will render is a search form, and so we have to take a look at the search form. The data that is going in is a message and person. So we are sending nothing as message, nothing as person. In the first time we are loading it because we're just loading the form. Second time we're sending the message and person. The message this time is a meaningful message saying either the person is found in the phone book with a phone number, or the person is not found in the phone book with no phone number. A person is the guy that is coming to you through the form. So let's take a look at how this works. So this time we should be looking at search form. But before doing that, let's also take a look at the view search form. So action is search form as expected, and the method is post as expected. And here the first one is a text input, and see that the default value is set to be person. How does it know what the person is? That is being sent to you, sent to the view by this render search form. Person is a second property of the object that is being sent. So that will be pre-filled here. The first time that is being loaded, it is coming in with person equal to nothing, empty string. So that is going to be empty string, but that's okay. And then there's just a submit button. And if there is a message, the message will be a code. So as you can see, the form is always there with a message near the bottom if there is a message. Let's look at it in Chrome, search form. So search phone book. Let's try with nothing first. So nothing, the empty string is not in the phone book. Let's try it with some spaces, not in the phone book. Let's try with something naughty like script. Script is not in the phone book, and script is rendered as script, not that is trying to run the script. So this means our rendering in EJS is with open angle bracket percentage equal sign. So let's verify that. So in the message it's open percentage and then equal sign, and that's the way it should be. If it was minus, on the other hand, it was minus, just to show you, reload this, and then let me say script. The script is actually run. So if I say script alert, see, I can actually hack it, which is no good, which is why you should always use this, especially if message is something that is created out of the values that are typed in by the user. Here message, if you remember, is from person's phone number. Person is something that the guy is typing in here in the form. So it is very, very dangerous to have those things. That was just a teachable moment. We have to look at a few more things. So if it is I think Bob was there, Bob's phone number is that. Let's try small Bob. It's not there. The other guy was Andy, and his phone number is that. And if I say Manoj is not in the phone book, but notice that the name that you type in is persisting, which is the way it was designed, and that comes from this default value, which is person being the one that you typed in. Good. Going through it once more using our slide. So the data, ideally this will come from a database later on. There is a search form that is being looked for, that is a route for a GET request, and if it is a GET request, it is using this view. So search form EJS is going to be there somewhere, but not somewhere, it's going to be there in the views folder, and that is going to get data, which is an object with message equal to nothing, message property is nothing, person property is nothing. And if there is something that is posted to the same route, then the person is unpacked from the body of the request, and a person is a property name, and a message is an empty message, but it is created here or here depending on whether the person is found in the phone book or not. And then again the original form is being rendered, so we have to look at the original form, which is from the view search form EJS residing in the views folder. So HTML body form action search form. So that is why post also had a route pointing to search form. The only thing to notice here is that person and message are coming from the server.js file, and that is being rendered here using equal because it's something coming from end user and being rendered there by EJS. And this one is a JavaScript code. If there is message, if message is not an empty string, just echo it. If it is an empty string, you can still just say this. So the whole if statement here is probably superfluous because message is either an empty string or a string with something meaningful in it. So just echo it. Even if it is empty string, who cares? So that would have worked anyway. So that's that. Now, there is a third exercise. This is going to be quite interesting. It's a bit hard to do. I remember this one from my last run. So try to do this. This will teach you a few more things about how to handle checkboxes and how to create them properly. And do try to do this, and don't ignore me. So there are the requirements there. So dynamic form and a table being created, etc. So what did we learn? So template engine, which is EJS, embedded JavaScript, and that's the one we're using. You could actually just use the literals, which means just a backtick, but that is not, as you saw, powerful enough. And the moment you start using the template engine and the EJS files, you can do a lot more. Particularly, you can actually put the values that the user typed in back into the form when you're actually redisplaying the form. That makes it very nice from the user perspective, usability perspective. So get used to this, and this kind of stuff will be tested in the lab test. And then we saw that we could use data from arrays or objects dynamically to dynamically generate forms or to handle forms, and that also is nice. But keep it in mind that later, as we get more and more sophisticated, we will be using databases as persistence layer, and they will be getting data from the database rather than hard coding it in terms of objects or arrays in your code. So that's that for today. So the most important thing today was actually EJS, the template engine that we will be using, and the view files that will reside in the views folder. Thank you for your attention, and as usual, all the best to you.